Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, we discuss the insertion of a new player in the fight to reform policing in the United States. But first, I recently spoke with Dr. Robert Bozick, director of the Houston Population Research Center of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University, about his recent paper titled An Increasing Disinterest in Fatherhood Among Childless Men in the United States, a Brief Report. The paper is to be published in the Journal of Marriage and Family and is sole authored. Before I get to the interview, if you're watching this on YouTube, I have 3 brief requests to make and 1 offer to extend. My requests: if you find the show or episode interesting, please like, subscribe, and comment. This is a good way to support the channel. My offer: if you want to receive no more than 1 email a week with a link to the new TWiSP episode, click the link in the description and then enter your email address. By doing this, you will be notified no more than once a week about new TWiSP episodes. Thanks. I appreciate it. Dr. Bozick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
And I'm glad to have you. The question is that I have to start us off is that, researchers have spent a great deal of time studying whether women want children, how many children they want, whether they end up with as many children as they desire, and what factors drive all of the above. Mm-hmm. And that research is both extremely solid and extremely important. But if you look for corresponding studies of men's fertility desires, there's precious little. Your paper steps in to start to help reverse that. But before we get to your paper, why has there been so little research on men's fertility preferences? Are scholars and the wider public just not interested in that?
I think there are probably 2 reasons that are likely intertwined. I think first off, we subscribe to the very strict gender roles, and we think of women as being the reproductive species. So that has for sure infiltrated our data collection procedures. So we know for a long time that one of the major sources of fertility data in the United States is the National Survey of Family Growth. And for a long time, they only interviewed women. So much of what we knew about about fertility and reproduction in general came from the viewpoint of women. Over time, there was, let me back up a bit. I would say initially, another reason that we tended to focus entirely on women was because that women can unequivocally account for the number of children that they have. So when you're asking questions about number of children you've had, dates, all of that, you tend to get much higher quality data from women than from men. And I believe there was even a paper in the 80s that had a recommendation about future federal statistics collected on fertility that told the federal government, don't even waste your time asking about men, because you're going to spend a lot of money and you're going to get lower quality data that you could get even better data by just focusing on women. Now, clearly, this has been slow to change over time. But I think we are now starting to get a better understanding of men's role in the family. And I think like any good social scientist would say, you're always looking for gaps in the literature. And I think really about in the late 90s, early 2000s, you started to see a lot more calls at the end of papers saying, hey, we know X, Y, and Z here, but fertility decisions are often, or most of the time, not just a single decision. So we need to start understanding men. So I'd say there's been a call for focusing on men, and that has been in place for a while, but the research itself has been slow to catch up.
Well, with one of the questions that's raised by this
tardiness or hesitancy or just the inertia is, well, is there anything about childless men that differs from, on average, from men in general, with men with children? I mean, do the outcomes of childless men differ? Do their behaviors or is it something about such that we would justify, or at least there would be a motivation to get more information on such men?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know from sociology of the family more broadly that involvement in family life has a whole host of positive outcomes for those who partake in it. There is research that compares childless men with fathers on a whole host of outcomes, namely health and socioeconomic well-being, and we tend to see that men without children are more likely to die earlier, more likely to suffer from disease and disability. They're more likely to commit crimes. They're more likely to be disengaged from their communities. Now, I will say a lot of this research is correlational, so we don't necessarily know if it is something magical about becoming a father that has a causal effect on these outcomes, but we do know that these broader correlations hold. And so that actually is one of the missing pieces in the research. I like your word tardiness. There's been an awareness of this and a sort of a slow march of researchers moving into this space. And so I suspect we'll see some better causal research on the linkages between parenthood and socioeconomic and health outcomes moving forward. But there are distinct, at least we know, disadvantages that are associated with men who remain childless.
Well, that's interesting, because if there are these, even if it's correlational, that sort of motivates more research, because maybe it turns out it's a spurious correlation. There's something else driving it, and it just so happens to partly determine who is childless and partly determine these other outcomes. Or it could be, but you wouldn't know that if you don't do the causal research.
Absolutely. Sam, if you allow me for 1 second to just mention something about terminology that I don't want to get trapped up in necessarily. I am going to by default say childless throughout. I would say that the bulk of the social demography literature uses that term. I am constantly reminded by my peers in the human development field, and psychology in particular, that we at times should make a distinction between childless and child-free. So childless, we typically think of people as ending up in the status of having ending up in the status of without having children, while that is something that is aspirational to them and they just somehow fail to achieve it. So we say childless as opposed to child-free, which is taking a much more independent stance upon the course of one's life and making a proactive decision to refrain. And so there are some minor distinctions there. And I know, like I said, social demography has been a little slow to adopt the child-free language. And I have some thoughts of why that might be the case. But I am more generally talking about men without children, regardless of if it was volitional or not. So I just want to throw that out there.
Well, that's helpful. Would you care to say what, speculative or hypotheses you have why social demography has been slower to adopt certain language?
This is purely speculative, Sam. I've got no hard data to show this, but this actually came out of a conversation I should mention. So when my paper was released, I posted it on Twitter, got a bunch of different reactions, and a psychologist at Michigan State engaged me on the topic. And we were going back and forth, and he pushed me a bit. He's like, why do you not say child-free or non-parent if you want to be completely value-laden? And I kind of caught me off guard, because then I started thinking, I wonder why most people in our field say childless. And the best I could speculate is that I do think demography tends to attract what I would call relatively progressive, but a pronatalist crowd. So I think we're always thinking in terms of family status because it's an essential function for sustaining population. So I think we've gotten in the habit of thinking of having children as being the default status. But I could see that linguistic change on the horizon in terms of how people think about this. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's sort of my take.
Yeah, but it's an important possibility because it does sort of signal or indicate that the terms we're using are connected to kind of pre-existing assumptions we may bring to it, maybe knowingly or not, or unknowingly. And so becoming conscious of that helps us realize, oh, I guess I'm looking at this way. But on your paper, you divided men into different groups by age, life course stage. What did you find when you looked at men of traditional childbearing ages, which is what, correct me if I'm wrong, 18 to 49 or something like that?
Yes. So I think the strongest findings come from looking at the broad swath of men between childbearing ages, which should note for folks, just to be specific here, the data come from the National Survey of Family Growth, which I had alluded to earlier, which when it was initially conceived, it was only administered to women. And so they focused on the ages at which women are biologically able to reproduce. And so initially, the study started at women of 18 to 45. Then, as we know, in the past 15 to 25 years, as marriage and childbearing has been delayed, as women have been staying in school longer, people are starting to have children later. And so they expanded to 18 to 49. So for men, I just want to point this out there, men can have children at most any age. And in fact, they tend to have children much later beyond age 49. But the data that I have available to me are just men between the ages of 18 to 49. And so when you're looking wholesale at those men who do not have children and you ask them, do you want to have children at any time? We saw an increase of I wrote this paper, not with co-authors. I saw an increase of 12 to 18% of men reported that they did not want children at any time. And that was spanning the years 2006 to 2019. I saw an even bigger jump in the responses to the question that asked men, would you not, asking men to agree or disagree with the statement that I would not be bothered at all if I did not have any children? We saw that increase from 21% to 31%. So a 10% increase just in the span of about 15 years. And so that was the impetus actually for me to write this paper. I was incidentally working on an entirely different paper looking at changes in men's sexual behavior. And one of the questions from the reviewers was they wanted to get a better understanding of some of the fertility intentions of men who were sexually inactive. So that's what caused me to take a peek at these two questions in the National Survey of Family Growth. And I had to, at first, I stepped back and I was like, is this right? And, I looked at the data every which way. So I was like curious to see, okay, we know this exists in this one sample. And I've been involved in many studies where I've looked at relationships between X and Y in one sample that did not hold and other samples that did not hold under different model specifications. So I started digging through other data sources where I knew that there were questions about fertility intentions posed directly toward men. And so my thinking in putting this research brief together was trying to take different snapshots of men from different samples at different ages, using, in some cases, quite different questions that are ultimately getting at the same construct to try to make sure that what I was seeing in the National Survey of Family Growth was not spurious.
Right, because that's helpful because if they ask the same question the same way over and over and over in all these different samples, you can't be certain that it's just the phrasing of the question is partly behind the answer. Whereas if you ask the same domain question, but using different words, and you're getting similar answers. It's a multiple measures question. But so what did you find so one of the issues was you looked at men with a high school diploma. Was the finding replicated? Were there sort of retreat or declining desire for children?
Yes. So the next study I focused on was the Monitoring the Future study, which is a repeated cross-sectional study to high school students. It's run out of the University of Michigan. And one of the cool things about the study is it asks a whole host of questions about how adolescents view their future. These are the segment of our population. They're on the cusp of the transition to adulthood. The whole world's in front of them. How do they envision their lives playing out? So that was where I turned my attention to next. Now, this is an interesting population that's in some ways quite different from the full gamut of men of reproductive age, because on the one hand, these are relatively young men, and very few of these men have children at all. So they are young, childless men, and they're in high school. So I thought it would be interesting to see, even at an early age, are we getting a sense of how men are sort of viewing their long-term trajectories, despite only being a few years into dating and sexual activity, et cetera. I thought was one of the more interesting findings was when there's a question that asks men, to list the number of children that you would like. And one of the answers is 0. So in 2000, only 2% of high school seniors said that they wanted 0 children. Now, this did not grow to a large percentage. It grew to 6% by 2019, but that is a tripling of the base rate over that time. So again, the majority of high school graduates still see children in their future, but you're even seeing this slight shift away from children, even among, like I said, men who have the least dating and sexual experiences.
So, and then you looked at a group of childless men transitioning to the workforce, and
correct.
I said, yeah.
Correct.
What did you was the finding? Was there a consistent finding with that group of men?
Absolutely, right. So the last group I looked at were men making the transition to adulthood, and I did this by looking at the panel study of income dynamics, which contains a cohort of children of the original family members of the panel study of income dynamics, for those of you who are familiar with the PSID. And as those children entered young adulthood, there's a special supplement to the survey that tracks their key milestones through the transition to adulthood. And so since I was able to get most of the stronger fertility intention questions from the other surveys, I was trying to get another metric that would potentially provide a different lens in terms of thinking about how young men, now these men I think are of particular importance because they are starting to enter their prime years of marriage and childbearing. And so the question that was asked to them was, how important is it for you to have a job with good parental leave? And I thought this was an interesting question because it forced men to think about work in relationship to their family lives. And as we know from all of the research, that the linkage between work and family, and at least in terms of decision-making about entering family roles, is much stronger for men than for women. And so not surprisingly, in accord with what we saw in the other studies, we saw a decline from about half the sample said it was very important for them to have a job that had a good parental leave policy. And we saw that decline to 42% in the span of 10 years. So we seem to see, like I said, different lenses from different surveys pointing to this general trend. And I should note, I tried to, when you're writing a journal article, when I looked at these findings on their own, I thought these findings are interesting in and of themselves. Before we even try to unpack what's going on here, I had yet to see any study that just documented these descriptive trends. So I was tempted to try to do a full-fledged paper where I was testing different theories. But given that I knew there was a big dearth in the research, I tried, and I really tried to push the Journal of Marriage and Family, and they were very responsive to the my request to make this a research note, because I wanted to begin the conversation. I don't have the answers here, but I do see a question that is unanswered.
Well, you may not have the answers to the next question, but you've definitely thought about it more than most. So as I'm thinking about there's some evidence that fertility rates have declined in the US, and your findings are consistent with the idea that men's fertility desires might be part of the reason for that. But are there, and this is where you were just kind of engaging, are there any theoretical explanations? Not necessarily proven explanations, but theoretical explanations or inclinations people might have to explain why men's fertility desires have declined.
Yes. So in the paper, I lay out 4. And so I'll briefly walk you through them, but then I'll tell you what I really think is going on, which ones I would lend more weight to. So it's very careful. Again, without evidence, I can't parse this out, at least, especially not in a short research note. But there are a lot of signs from adjacent literature on changes in the family that I think have some import here. So the 4 reasons that I list as possible reasons for this observed decline in an interest in having children, first one is structural. So this explanation focuses on the broader relationship between men and women in society, particularly around gender norms related toward work. We know that over the years, as women have entered the labor force, as they have started going to college and have gone to college at higher rates than men, they have a lot more bargaining power in marriage. And at the same time that women's opportunities within the labor force and their increased equality within marital relationships over the past few decades, we've also seen a relative decline in men's economic standing. So we know, for example, between the 60s and the late 2000s, the percentage of men in their prime childbearing ages who are out of the labor force has tripled. And it has increased actually 7-fold for men who are non-college educated. So men are stagnating in their levels of education, their wages are stagnating. So it is becoming more difficult for men to essentially prove their marriageability in a dating market. So as women's power has increased, men's power has decreased, and this has created a roadblock for men. I could go a lot more into that, but I do want to say one thing that's important to note here, or a reminder. I think it's something we know without even having to look at the statistics, but men view children slightly differently than women, in as much as decisions to have children for men are almost entirely tied to decisions to be in a romantic union. You don't see too many men who are desiring to have children so that they can just pay a child support payment and not get married, right? So men are thinking much more. Now, this isn't to say that women don't think in terms of marriage when they're thinking of children, but it's an even stronger overlay. So as I'm talking about economic bargaining power within marital relationships, that's intrinsically tied to how men see their ability to support a family. So that was a long way of saying that is sort of the key structural explanation. There is an evolutionary perspective on this, which is in some ways tied to the structural perspective. We know from evolutionary biology and physiology that the strongest males, those with the most resources, are the most likely to reproduce. You see this across species. See it in humans. So the fact that we're seeing some declining levels of male potential human capital, that might explain why we see a decline. The third explanation is cultural. I think this is one of the reasons that tends to get ascribed to why women want fewer children. So as women have entered the labor force and norms about gender within families have changed, there's been an increase, a movement toward, sort of more postmodern ideals about autonomy and individualization and being freed from traditional patriarchal norms about the family. Those changes are not happening in a vacuum, and men are not immune to those broader secular changes as well. So it could be, as the culture is shifting toward more like self-actualization and individualization, that men too are adopting some of those ideas that we have typically looked at through the lens of women. And lastly, there's been some evidence coming out of biology, and it's still relatively new, that there is been a decline in men's testosterone levels over the past few decades and in men's sperm quality. So there could be potentially a biological component here, right? So with lower testosterone, you have lower sex drive. With poor sperm quality, you have a biological impediment to having children. So could be all four of those things, probably some combination of all of them. But those were the four theories that I outlined in my paper. And my hope is that researchers take that as a starting point to try to unpack which theory is most dominant.
You indicated that you would give a sense of your own sort of where you would start looking first.
Yep.
If you were, because you've said a couple times that you don't have data to really take this apart. So then that's appropriately cautious. But if you were to start the next step to try to figure it out, where would you be looking first? Maybe that's.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. So as context, I should note that as with any trend that you're looking at in American society, and the editors of the Journal of Marriage and Family, one of their first questions to me was, why are you not looking at this by race, by ethnicity, by SES, by age? And I actually tried to push back on that, not because I don't think the differences are important, but because I didn't want to immediately take this very interesting new population and start subdividing it right away, and then the focus gets shifted away from that population on its own terms. So one of the things, though, that I did, because of course people are going to want to know how these things differ by race and SES, is I did include an appendix that breaks out the patterns by race and SES. Now the racial ethnic patterns are a bit all over the map, and they're not consistent. What you do see, however, is and again, it's not consistent on every metric, but it's consistent enough that I feel comfortable, also to the extent that I know that this comports with other research, that more educated, more affluent men are more likely to aspire to and have children than lower educated, less resourced men. So that fits very much in line with that structural explanation I was talking about. And there's been a lot of research, particularly on low-income populations, about the importance of getting a job, having a long-term partner, having your stuff figured out in place before you're going to make this gigantic investment into having a family. And so for low-income men, that's one, a higher barrier to achieve, but also a much more risky one if it goes off the rails because of paying child support. So I think the structural explanation is probably more dominant for those men who lack a high school diploma. So that was the distinction that I looked at actually in the appendix. We know that the economic bar to marriage, there's an interesting paper in demography, and I'm blanking on the author's name, that while there's this economic bar to marriage, once you do get married, the effect of SES tends to dissipate with respect to whether or not you have a kid or not. So the whole hurdle is getting into the marriage. So for those who are more educated, I think there's probably more to do with that cultural explanation. I think people who are married tend to be more educated, have more money, live in urban areas, They've got more postmodern cosmopolitan beliefs. They're sculpting out their lives in new and different ways. I think that explanation, if you were to ask more highly educated men, you would get responses that reflect personal autonomy and sort of a more individual control over one's life course. So that's what I would expect, a bifurcation of reasons.
So I just want to go back to the structural for a moment. And
sure.
You were talking about how part of the structural explanation for declining fertility, anyway, at least that some people offer, would point to women having more opportunities, and therefore, maybe in the same woman, 50 years ago with fewer opportunities, then, having children is basically going to be, dominant. But with the more opportunities, and these aren't necessarily just easily combined all the time, depending upon the timing and so forth, and then you also had indicated those opportunities and economic fortunes may have improved, if I'm not, at the same time that men's are declining. But you didn't say this, and I just want to be clear that you didn't say it's a zero sum. You didn't say that as women's conditions improve, men's conditions necessarily decline. That's an empirical pattern that we're seeing, but it's not a required pattern. You could have both women's prospects improving and men's economic prospects improving, but it just isn't the case. Is that a fair clarification of what you were saying?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I do not see these things as zero sum. And if I inadvertently intended that was not to be the case. I was just trying to point out there are these two trends that are happening in society that I actually think, let me back up. I'm not sure if they're entirely separate, but they do hint at differences between the genders. And I do think in instances, actually, to take your point a step further, in instances where men's and women's economic prospects are improving, for those populations, those are going to be the populations that are going to be most likely to get married and have children, right? Because of the high cost of having kids, which also one of those things that we all know that I probably didn't need to spell out, but having kids is quite expensive and has become more expensive. So that the cost issue is huge here. So in those cases, among those populations where those trends are both moving upward, I think that's where you really start to see, a higher likelihood of marriage and children. I think it's in the opposite direction where you have dating markets where men's economic prospects are declining and women's are improving, that you really see this mismatch, and this economic bar to marriage really starts to evidence itself to men.
So at some point, fertility decline becomes a concern, though people might disagree what that point is because of a planet of nearly 8 billion people. Some people would say right now, fertility decline is a concern. Other people might say it'll be a concern if we, at other points, if it continues and so forth. But what I'm trying to say is I don't want to, one doesn't need to take a position on whether now is the time or not to answer the question, because I'm assuming at some point, the decline needs to be stabilized or reversed. So is there any message in your findings or in the theoretical explanations for policymakers who today or someday may need to address this decline and arrest this decline of men's fertility desires? Or is this something that is just outside of policy and it's just going to be, people's desires are going to be whatever they are, and there's nothing anyone can do whether they want to or not?
Well, as you know, population growth good, population growth bad. It'd be a 5-hour-long conversation and one that has flooded our field for many decades, and rightfully so. It's an interesting question. I tried to, as much as I could in the paper, not make my paper about fertility decline. I will say, when I did post about my paper on Twitter, I referred to the trends that I observed as troubling, which set off a lot of questions from people of what I meant by troubling. A lot of people thought I was referring to population growth or or population decline. And I was not thinking of it as troubling at all from that respect. I see this trend as troubling. And I should note here too, when I say troubling, I don't mean a 5-alarm fire. I mean, if like we're talking like a Likert scale, we're talking like 1 point in the direction of something concerning. What I think is troubling about this is twofold, and then I'll connect this to policy, which was your question. So first, we're starting to learn quite a bit more about what is being referred to as disconnected men. As I mentioned earlier, there's been a huge increase in young men who are not in the labor force. Coinciding with that, we're seeing an increase in men living at home with their parents, men who are financially dependent on their parents, men who are not going to college. We're seeing spikes in rates of depression among young men. We've already known a bit about the deaths of despair at midlife, and we're starting to see some seeds of that trickle down to young adults. So I think there are some real concerns here. So when I saw these trends in the graphs that I produced, I was not necessarily seeing fertility decline, although that is likely contributing to fertility decline. I was seeing these things as evidence of a broader problem that is potentially under-addressed in the social sciences. So that's why I thought it was troubling. Now, for policy, I think we need to understand this a bit more before we actually make that big jump into policy. So what I'm going to offer is not necessarily going to be novel or groundbreaking, but I do think it's quite important. If it really is, well, so if we accept my explanations here, right? So high SES, this is an individualization, postmodern thing. That's probably on its own trajectory. The more troublesome group are these disconnected men, right? Who don't have much to offer in the way of dating and are being essentially shut out of family life in some cases, which we know has downstream consequences. I think truly, if that's what's going on, I think we need to think a bit more about who are these men and what parts of the country are they living? What are their economic opportunities look like? And we already know that a big driver of the fertility decline, especially post the Great Recession, actually had to do with deindustrialization, right? We've lost manufacturing jobs, goods production jobs. Those are the things that create this uncertainty about the ability to sustain a family. So I think at the end of the day, employment policy is family policy. And in line with that, we know that in the United States, we've got one of the weakest social safety nets with respect to childcare. So if we want to do something to eliminate the economic stress associated with having children, that is one thing that may trickle down into men's calculus to have children if they know that there's a little bit of a cushion there for them to potentially have to endure a spell or two of unemployment without the risk of their entire savings being blown apart.
Dr. Bozick, this is certainly an important departure and setting out to bring in the other half of the equation of well, not only fertility, but just the development of a society and the maintenance of its ability to maintain itself and people to be happy and fulfilled. Because I think that's kind of the theme of what you're talking about at the end, about how it's not just about are there going to be children? It's also about what kinds of lives the people are going to be able to live as they make the transitions from childhood to adulthood. Just a fascinating and important set of work. I'm really grateful for your doing that work, and I appreciate your coming on and sharing it with us today.
Thank you so much, Sam. I enjoyed it.
Our final segment concerns an unexpected and largely effective source of demands for changes in policing. On September 14th, the Washington Post published another story in their continuing coverage of policing in America. The story? Insurers force change on police departments long resistant to it. Apparently, many sheriff and police departments serving small and mid-sized communities organize into regional risk pools. Some mid-sized departments obtain insurance directly, as do some large departments. The largest departments often either self-insure by establishing a special fund for settlements or by paying settlements directly out of city or county funds. The largest departments, therefore, are not vulnerable to insurance provider requirements. For jurisdictions requiring insurance services, insurers have started to demand that police departments change their policies on chokeholds, screen cadets differently to bounce rogue candidates early, train officers in de-escalation techniques, require body cameras be worn and turned on, stop high-speed pursuits in the case of minor infractions, and more. Sometimes insurers make these demands of departments they already cover and refuse to renew the coverage otherwise. Sometimes insurance companies refuse to even begin providing coverage unless the changes are made. Departments that can secure insurance without reforming still face steeply rising insurance rates and deductibles. Relatedly, departments that are part of regional risk pools face pressure to reform from nearby jurisdictions because one member's poor behavior raises rates for everyone in the pool. Some departments have resisted this pressure and been dumped from the pool by their neighboring jurisdictions. For example, in 2009, when the 60-officer Maywood, California Police Department refused insurer requests to adopt more than a dozen changes to reduce violent encounters with the public, the risk pool ended its coverage. The department disbanded. While those fighting to reform police departments welcome insurers joining the effort, the effectiveness of insurance companies is bittersweet. Seeing the insurers make a difference, after fighting for years to get the police of his St. Anne community to reform with little success, John Charnoff noted that he was dismayed that it took money, instead of injuries caused by reckless car chases, to make change. He said, quote, "It's an indictment on St. Anne police and their priorities that the voice of their insurers spoke louder than human lives." Sociologically speaking, when it comes to social change, some injustices require the deployment of financial leverage in order to make change, and some injustices do not. Some injustices occur because there are people who just do not know the impact of their actions. For example, people may not realize that a particular way of raising children harms girls, and if that's the case, informing them of that reality enables them to try to stop raising their children in that way. There's no clear role for financial leverage in this social change story. Instead, the key mechanism for social change is the spread of information broadly. In contrast, sometimes the people with the power to change know a practice is unjust, but they still refuse to make changes. In such cases, leveraging financial consequences can make the decisive difference. And in such cases, the financial tool is often sitting there in the toolbox. Yet one reason it may be overlooked is that often the means to wield it may have been unilaterally dismantled. For example, the article states, quote, "Where community activists, use of force victims, and city officials have failed to persuade police departments to change dangerous and sometimes deadly policing practices, insurers are successfully dictating changes to tactics and policies." That's the problem right there. The city officials failed to persuade. Activists and use of force victims do not have the hammer of budget authority. Ultimately, all activists can do is make the case to decision makers and to the wider public. In contrast, many city officials do have budget authority, and thus, formally, they have more tools than just simple persuasion. Most city officials have long had the ability to link police funding to police conduct. City officials could have said, here's your baseline funding to maintain service day to day. You want budget for overtime, new cars, conference attendance for the leadership, other perks consistent with the job? That depends on if you enact these reforms. Instead, city officials accepted the decoupling of police conduct and consequences. Having accepted that condition, it's no wonder that efforts at mere persuasion are ineffective. Of course, insurers are not entering this space purely out of the goodness of their hearts either. They are entering because there is little money to be made if the premiums are dwarfed by the payouts. And over the last decade or so, there's been a rise in jury skepticism toward police officer claims, which translates into a greater risk of police losing cases and a greater risk of high jury awards. This change is also leading jurisdictions to seek to settle cases and to settle them quickly to avoid the cost of litigation. Of course, insurers are not entering this space unaware of these dynamics. These changes are leading jurisdictions to behave differently, and insurance companies are trying to aid and speed up their move to a different model. Now, some law enforcement officials have claimed that these changes would endanger the public. Overall, public safety does not appear to have been compromised. Thus, both insurer support for the changes and evidence of continuing police effectiveness suggests that the changes activists demanded are not damaging. Of course, partly, public safety has been sustained because some of the practices are wholly unnecessary. Obviously, escalating conflict is not helpful. But even pursuing a suspect in a high-speed chase is no longer necessary, as technology now allows police officers to shoot a sticky dart out of the front of the police cruiser, which attaches to the suspect's car. Multiple officers can then use GPS to track the car from afar and pull up after the suspect parks. As one officer in the article said, quote, "You should see the look on their face when we pull up. They think they've outrun us." Policing will always have an element of danger, but some practices inherently impose unnecessary or even counterproductive dangers on bystanders, suspects, or both. With technology making some practices obsolete, better understanding of de-escalation techniques and their value, and greater ability to proactively weed out potentially poor job candidates, one wonders, why do some police departments wait until the hammer of financial liability is raised before reluctantly reforming? What is it about those jurisdictions and/or the task of policing that maintains a commitment to driving fast and roughing up people, even as the case for the necessity of those methods crumbles away? That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We'll be back next week with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care.